My name is Emily Carter, and I want to tell you about the day I learned that respect doesn't always come from the people who should love you most. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came. Grandpa was gone. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special greeting for you in a future story here. I stood in my small apartment on base, holding the phone with trembling fingers, listening to my aunt's voice telling me the details. Heart attack. Sudden. Peaceful, she said. But nothing about losing the only person who ever truly believed in me felt peaceful. Grandpa was the one who taught me to stand straight, to speak with purpose, to never apologize for taking up space in a world that constantly tried to make me smaller. When I was 8 and other kids laughed at my short hair, he'd ruffle it and say, "Strong trees don't bend in weak winds, soldier." When I was 16 and announced I wanted to join the military, while everyone else called it a phase, he simply nodded and said, "You'll make us proud." The funeral was set for Friday. 3 days to get leave approved, 3 days to prepare myself to face a family that had barely spoken to me since I enlisted 2 years ago. 3 days to decide whether I'd wear civilian clothes and blend into their disappointment, or wear my uniform and stand for everything Grandpa taught me to be. I chose the uniform. I chose him. Thursday night, I pressed every crease until it was sharp enough to cut through doubt. I polished every button until I could see my reflection. A reflection of a woman he'd be proud of, but my hands were shaking as I hung it up, because I knew what was coming. I knew how they'd look at me, what they'd whisper. I knew I'd be walking into a room full of people who saw my service not as honor, but as rebellion. That night, I dreamed of his workshop, the smell of wood, polish and old coffee, his weathered hands showing me how to properly clean his old service rifle from Korea. "Discipline is love, Emily," he'd say. "Taking care of your tools, your appearance, your word, that's how you love yourself and others." In the dream, he smiled at my uniform and whispered, "Perfect, soldier." I woke up knowing I'd made the right choice. Chapter 2. She came with words that burn. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, matching the weight in my chest. I drove the 3 hours from base to my hometown, passing familiar landmarks that felt like echoes of a life I'd left behind. The old water tower, the high school where I'd never quite fit in, the diner where Grandpa used to take me for pancakes every Sunday after church. I pulled into Aunt Margaret's driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires like broken promises. Through the window I could see the house full of relatives, people who used to bounce me on their knees, who now acted like I was a stranger who happened to share their DNA. The moment I stepped out of my car in full dress uniform, I felt the shift. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and then, cutting through the silence like a knife, came Tyler's voice. "Seriously? You came in costume?" My cousin stood on the front porch, 26 years old and still acting like he was in high school. His laugh was sharp and cruel. "This is a funeral, not a parade, Emily. Have some respect." The words hit me like physical blows. Not because they were particularly clever or cutting, but because they came from family. Because in a moment when I was already drowning in grief, someone I'd grown up with chose to push my head underwater instead of throwing me a lifeline. I didn't respond. Grandpa had taught me that silence was often the strongest response to weakness. I walked past Tyler, past the relatives who couldn't meet my eyes, past the whispers that followed me like shadows. I found a chair in the corner of the living room, and sat down, my back straight, my hands folded, my heart breaking quietly. "She always had to be different," I heard someone murmur. "Always had to be the center of attention. Poor Harold would be embarrassed. She's making this about her." Each word was a small wound, but I'd learned to carry wounds without flinching. In the desert you learn that pain is temporary, but dignity is forever. So I sat there, surrounded by family but completely alone, and I waited. Chapter 3. I was there, but invisible. The viewing lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of watching people who barely knew my grandfather tell stories about him, while I, who had spent every summer with him, who had learned everything I valued from him, sat silent in my corner like a piece of furniture no one wanted to acknowledge. Cousin Tyler held court near the casket, playing the role of the grieving grandson. For people who hadn't seen him visit Grandpa once in the past 2 years, he told stories I knew were exaggerated, emotions that felt performed. When someone asked about Grandpa's military service, Tyler waved dismissively. "Oh, he didn't talk much about Korea. said it wasn't important anymore. My hands clenched in my lap. Not important. The medals in his bedroom drawer, the way he still stood at attention during the national anthem, the pride in his voice when he talked about serving his country. None of that was important, but I stayed quiet. I watched, I listened, and I remembered every word, every dismissive gesture, every moment they erased the parts of him that meant the most to me. Mrs. Henderson, our old neighbor, approached me during the second hour. She was one of the few people who smiled when she saw my uniform. "He talked about you all the time," she whispered. "Showed everyone the letters you sent. He was so proud, honey, so proud." Her words were a lifeline in a sea of indifference. At least, someone understood what I was there to honor. As people filtered in and out, offering condolences to everyone but me, I noticed something strange. Several older men in suits kept glancing my way with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not disapproval, like my family. Something else. Recognition maybe. Respect. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and ramrod posture, caught my eye and nodded slightly. I nodded back, uncertain but polite. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. The funeral director announced it was time to prepare for the procession to the cemetery. As everyone gathered their belongings and headed for their cars, I remained in my corner for just a moment longer, looking at Grandpa's casket and making him a silent promise. I won't let them forget who you really were. Chapter 4. The decision that changed everything. The procession to Greenwood Cemetery was a long line of cars moving slowly through the town where I'd grown up. I drove alone, 3 cars behind the hearse, watching familiar streets blur past. The radio was off, the windows were up. It was just me and the memory of his voice telling me to stand tall, soldier. At the cemetery, the family gathered around the gravesite while the funeral director organized everyone for the service. I stood slightly apart from the main group, not by choice, but because nobody made room for me in their circle of grief. I was family, but I wasn't family. I belonged, but I didn't belong. The minister began speaking about Grandpa's life, his work at the steel mill, his marriage to Grandma Rose, his children and grandchildren. It was a nice speech, generic and safe, but it missed the essence of who Harold Carter really was. It missed the man who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite the fear. As the service continued, I noticed more people arriving, not family members or close friends, but men and women in military dress uniform. They stood at a respectful distance, but their presence was unmistakable. Who were they? Why were they here? My Aunt Margaret noticed them too. She kept glancing over with confusion and what looked like annoyance. Tyler was completely oblivious, checking his phone during the When the minister finished his remarks, he asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. Tyler stepped forward immediately, launching into a speech about what a simple, hard-working man Grandpa was. Simple, as if dedicating your life to family and country and doing it with honor was simple, as if the depth of his character could be reduced to a Hallmark card sentiment. Nobody else spoke, not even Aunt Margaret, his own daughter. They were content to let Tyler's shallow eulogy be the final word on a man who deserved so much more. I felt the weight of my uniform, the responsibility it represented. I thought about the letters Grandpa had sent me during basic training, during my deployment, during the long months when I felt most alone. I thought about his voice saying, "Sometimes you have to speak up for what's right, even when your voice shakes." My voice would definitely shake, but I stood up anyway. Chapter 5. Coming back wasn't the plan. I'd like to say something. My voice cut through the murmur of people preparing to leave. Every head turned toward me, some with surprise, some with irritation. I walked to the front of the gathered mourners, my dress shoes clicking against the wet grass. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it, but I kept Grandpa's lessons in my mind. Stand straight, look people in the eye, speak your truth. Harold Carter wasn't simple, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. He was complicated in the most beautiful way. He was a man who served his country in Korea, who came home and never complained about the nightmares or the cold that settled in his bones. He was a man who worked 37 years at the steel mill, who never missed a day, who taught us that showing up is half of everything. I could see Tyler shifting uncomfortably. Aunt Margaret's face was getting red. He was a man who taught me that honor isn't something you wear or something you claim. It's something you live. Every day, in small choices and big ones. He taught me that sometimes love looks like discipline, And sometimes courage looks like silence, and sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. My voice did start to shake then, but I didn't stop. He taught me that service, whether to country or family or community, isn't about getting recognition or thanks. It's about knowing that you did what needed to be done, even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. The military personnel who had been standing at a distance were now closer, listening intently. I could see approval in their faces, understanding that my family couldn't seem to muster. Harold Carter wasn't simple. He was extraordinary in the most humble way possible, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to live to the example he set. I walked back to my place in the crowd, my hands trembling but my spine straight. Tyler looked like he wanted to say something, but before he could, something happened that changed everything. A black sedan pulled up to the cemetery entrance. Chapter 6. Everything was the same, except me. The sedan's doors opened, and 3 figures stepped out. Even from a distance, I could tell they were military. Their posture, their purposeful movement, the way they surveyed the scene before approaching. But it wasn't until they got closer that I realized who was leading them. General Patricia Hastings. 3 stars on her shoulder, commander of the entire Eastern Division. I'd seen her picture in military publications, heard her speak at ceremonies I'd watched online. She was a legend, a woman who'd broken barriers and commanded respect in a world that didn't give it easily. And she was walking directly toward our small funeral gathering. The crowd seemed to sense something significant was happening. Conversations died. Even Tyler stopped fidgeting with his phone. Everyone watched as the general and her companions approached the gravesite with military precision. My heart started racing for entirely different reasons now. Why was she here? What did she want? Did I do something wrong? Had my emotional speech somehow violated protocol? General Hastings stopped directly in front of me. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, met mine. For a moment that felt like an eternity, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the old oak trees that bordered the cemetery. Then, slowly and deliberately, General Hastings raised her hand in a perfect salute. I responded automatically, my training taking over even as my mind reeled with confusion. We held the salute for several beats, a moment of military ceremony in the middle of a civilian funeral that suddenly felt more sacred than anything that had happened all day. When we lowered our hands, she spoke, her voice clear and carrying across the silent crowd. "Lieutenant Carter," she said, using my rank with the kind of respect I hadn't heard from anyone else all day. "Your grandfather would be proud of the soldier you've become. Your service honors not just your country but his memory." The silence that followed was complete. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. I could feel every eye on us, feel the shift in the atmosphere as my family tried to process what they were witnessing. But General Hastings wasn't done. Chapter 7. The silence that revealed everything. Harold Carter, General Hastings continued, turning to address the entire gathering, was more than just a veteran of the Korean War. He was a hero whose actions saved dozens of lives during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. He never spoke about it because that's the kind of man he was. Humble, private, more concerned with doing his duty than getting credit for it. She paused, letting that information settle over the crowd like morning mist. I could see the confusion on my family's faces, the way they looked at each other as if trying to reconcile this new information with the quiet man they thought they knew. "What Lieutenant Carter may not know," the general continued, her eyes finding mine again, "is that her grandfather wrote to me 6 months ago. He told me about his granddaughter who had enlisted, who was serving with distinction, who embodied everything he'd tried to teach about service and sacrifice." My breath caught in my throat. Grandpa had written to her, about me. He was proud, she said simply. So proud that he wanted me to know that his legacy was continuing through her. He asked me to watch over her career, to make sure she had the opportunities she deserved. He said she was the best of his family, the one who truly understood what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. I felt tears threatening, but I held them back. Not here, not in front of everyone, but inside. Something was breaking and healing at the same time. Tyler's face had gone completely pale. Aunt Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. The relatives who had been whispering about my uniform earlier now couldn't meet my eyes. General Hastings reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope. He asked me to give you this if anything happened to him. He said you'd know when the right time was to read it. I took the envelope with hands that only trembled slightly. My name was written on it in Grandpa's careful handwriting. For my soldier, Emily. Thank you, ma'am. I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once, then looked around at the gathered mourner. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding attention and respect. Honor isn't inherited, she said. It's earned. Harold Carter earned it every day of his life, and he passed that understanding on to his granddaughter. Some of you might want to remember that. Chapter 8. She thought nobody would remember. The general's words hung in the air like a challenge, as she and her companions prepared to leave. But before they did, she turned back to me one more time. Lieutenant Carter, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment. We walked a few steps away from the crowd, close enough to Grandpa's casket that I could still feel his presence. The general's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her military bearing. Your grandfather's letter came at an interesting time, she said quietly. I've been watching your service record, and I'm impressed. Your performance during the humanitarian mission in Honduras, your leadership during training exercises, you have potential that shouldn't be wasted. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There's a position opening up in my command structure, strategic operations, some travel, significant responsibility. It would mean a promotion to captain, and a chance to make a real difference. Your grandfather thought you were ready for bigger challenges. A promotion, a position in her command. 6 months ago, I would have been ecstatic, but standing there, looking at my family's stunned faces, I felt something else. Not quite satisfaction, but maybe understand. I appreciate the opportunity, ma'am, I said carefully. May I have some time to consider it? Of course. But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often. She handed me her card. Call me within the week. After the general and her team left, the mood at the cemetery completely shifted. Suddenly, relatives who had been avoiding me all day were trying to catch my eye. People who had whispered about my uniform were now approaching with forced smiles and awkward attempts at conversation. Emily, I had no idea about your grandfather's military service, Aunt Margaret said, her voice nervous. He never talked about it. He talked about it with me, I replied simply. Tyler appeared at my elbow, his earlier smugness replaced with something that might have been shame. Hey cuz. About earlier, I was just joking around, you know, family teasing. I looked at him for a long moment. This morning, his words had hurt because I still cared what he thought. Now after everything that had happened, his opinion felt as light as air. I know exactly what it was, I said. Chapter 9. A letter, a truth, a turning point. That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room, staring at the envelope General Hastings had given me. I'd been carrying it for hours, feeling its weight, wondering what final words Grandpa had left for me. The funeral reception had been surreal. Family members who had treated me like an unwelcome stranger suddenly wanted to hear about my military service, to understand what I did, to claim connection to my accomplishment. The same people who had whispered about my costume were now asking for photos with me in my uniform. I didn't give them what they wanted. I was polite but distant, present but not available, because I'd learned something important today. Their acceptance wasn't worth the price of my dignity. Finally, as the sun set outside my hotel window, I opened Grandpa's letter. My dearest Emily, it began in his careful handwriting. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I hope you're wearing your uniform. I hope they saw you in it, and I hope they finally understood what I've always known, that you are the best of us. The tears I'd been holding back all day finally came. I wrote to General Hastings because I wanted to make sure someone in your corner understood your work. I've watched you grow from a little girl who preferred muddy boots to fancy dresses, into a woman who chose service over comfort, courage over convenience. You are everything I hoped you would become. He wrote about the letters I'd sent him, about how proud he was during my graduation from basic training, about the newspaper clipping of my unit's commendation that he'd kept in his wallet. I know our family hasn't always understood you. They see your strength as stubbornness, your independence as rebellion, your service as abandonment. They're wrong, but their wrongness isn't your burden to carry. The letter went on for 3 pages, filled with memories, advice, and love. But it was the ending that changed everything. You have a choice to make, soldier. You can stay and try to earn the respect of people who never deserved yours. Or you can keep moving forward toward the future you were meant to have. Choose forward. Always choose forward. With all my love and pride, your grandfather. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I picked up General Hastings' card and my phone. Chapter 10. The Choice I Made with a Heart at Peace. I called General Hastings on Sunday morning, 2 days after the funeral. Her aide answered, but she came on the line quickly. Lieutenant Carter, I was hoping to hear from you. I'd like to accept the position, ma'am. When do I start? Excellent. Report to Fort Braxton next Monday. We'll have your orders ready. After I hung up, I called Aunt Margaret. I could hear the surprise in her voice when she answered. We hadn't spoken since the funeral, despite her awkward attempts to reconnect. Emily, is everything all right? I'm calling to let you know I'm taking a new position. I'll be moving to North Carolina next week. Oh. A pause. Well, that's wonderful, dear. We'll miss you. We both knew that wasn't true, but I let it pass. I wanted to ask you about Grandpa's house, I continued. I know the family is planning to sell it, but I'd like to buy some of his things. His tools, maybe some furniture, things that meant something to him. Another pause. Longer this time. Well, Tyler was hoping to get the workshop tools, and we thought we'd sell most of the furniture. I waited. Sometimes silence says more than words. But I suppose we could work something out. She finished lamely. Thank you. I'll send you a list. Before we hung up, she said, Emily, I'm sorry if I didn't handle things well at the funeral. We just didn't know about your grandfather's military service. About what you do. You didn't know because you never asked. I said gently, but it's okay, Aunt Margaret. We're family. Family forgives. I forgave them because Grandpa would have wanted me to. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. And it didn't mean pretending things were different than they were. I spent my last few days on base packing up my small apartment and preparing for the move. As I folded my dress uniform, the one Tyler had called a costume, I thought about how much had changed in just a few days. I'd learned that respect from strangers meant more than approval from family. I'd learned that the people who truly matter will find you, no matter where you are. And I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is not trying to change their mind about you. On my last evening, I drove past Grandpa's house one more time. The windows were dark, the driveway empty. Tomorrow, Tyler would start going through his things, deciding what had value and what didn't. But I already knew what had value. I had it in my heart, in my training, in my commitment to the principles he'd taught me. I had it in my uniform and in my service and in the choice to keep moving forward. As I drove toward my new life, I could almost hear his voice in the wind. Perfect, soldier. You're perfect. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The end.